Natalija Majsova se nam predstavlja z prispevkom Archived Utopias and Memorable Futures, Decoding Soviet Science Fiction Cinema for Tomorrow. Natalija, please.
Thank you, Christina, once again for your very kind invitation and your suggestion that I actually use this conference as an opportunity to give a small teaser into my upcoming book on the subject, on Soviet science fiction cinema in relation to the space age. So accordingly, my short presentation today is a reflection on this fairly extensive project that I'd worked on and off for the past 5 years. I researched Soviet space utopias in the context of Soviet and post-Soviet, mostly science fiction feature cinema, as visualizations of past futures and as both mnemonic devices and objects of cultural memory, attempting to follow the recent developments at the intersection of science fiction and utopia studies, and to grasp and re-articulate the concept of utopia and its transformations, accounting for the levels of the individual and the social, and in terms of both representation and becoming. Let me just share my screen. In my analysis of the politically utopian impulses at the heart of particular utopian worlds, I took a step back from the classical Souvenian or Jamesonian definition that aligns truly utopian desire with the transformative political projects Marxist at heart. My starting point was an empty framework of utopia as an imaginary space-age society. Its impulses, desires, and coordinates were then determined through close readings of particular films, uncovering a very complex imaginary of utopias within this corpus of around 30 productions, ranging from early 20th century fantastic projections, such as Aelita and Cosmic Voyage, to socialist realist space utopias of museum-like communist societies, to didactic and fairy tale-like youth science fiction, to introspective masterpieces such as Tarkovsky's Solaris, and then to postmodernist satires of the 1990s, and finally to the 21st century pensive and then thrilling and spectacular re-articulations of space race history. Now, I realize the danger of overly ambitious generalizations. However, several interesting insights might be worth sharing regarding the nature of these outlines Soviet pop space utopias. Let's first look at apparently projective utopian visions of the space-age future, most often associated with socialist realist and socialist realist influenced productions from the 1960s, such as The Heaven's Call, Toward a Dream, Andromeda Nebula. And then there are 1970s children's science fiction films like Moscow Cassiopeia and Teens in the Universe or Teens in Space. Now, apart from being simple representations of communist social order in space, these films conjoin ideas of museum-like communist future in space with very traditional value hierarchies. These involve strict heteronormativity and rather rigid gender roles, marking females as mothers, wives, and sidekicks, as you can see from these slides as well. And there are also, of course, tacit affirmations of Russian or Soviet intellectual superiority. In these quasi-conflictless worlds of these aforementioned films, because the plots are not supposed to excite, they're rather supposed to convince, these messages were consistently generated as latent byproducts of the plot, suggesting the particularly important role of this segment of space cinema, the role that it played in the domain of cultivating a certain collective imaginary and an anticipatory memory. Here you can see scans from a popular science journal, Nauka и Жизнь, from 1958. So at the very, very dawn of the space age, and there's already this projective kind of timeline ending with humans landing on foreign planets. This is what I'm talking about. This also transpires in science fiction from this period. These messages permeated visually and narratively distant later futures and even reappeared in recent Russian historical space thrillers from the 21st century. The static nature of many Soviet space utopias thus need not be considered as a peculiarity of world building, but rather as a reflection of the film's social mnemonic function to assure the stability of the described symbolic imaginary across time, genres, and aesthetic preferences. I would like to demonstrate what I mean by this aesthetic and narrative and rhythmic stability even by playing an extract from a song from a 1963 science fiction film, Toward a Dream.
Я земля, я своих провожаю питомцев, сыновей дочерей. Долетайте до самого солнца и домой возвращайтесь скорей. Долетайте до самого солнца и домой возвращайтесь скорей. Покидаем мы землю родную для того, чтоб до звезд и планет донести нашу правду земную и земной наш поклон и привет. Для того, чтобы всюду победно звучал чистый голос любви, долгожданный сигнал. Я земля, я своих провожаю питомцев, сыновей дочерей. Долетайте до самого солнца и домой возвращайтесь скорее.
Okay, this was enough. This was just to give you an impression about this stability, which you can feel even in the rhythm, but also to give you an impression of these visuals, which are very impressive for the early 1960s. We're talking about pre-CGI. Interestingly enough, Roger Corman would buy rights to these early 1960s films and then would re-edit them for American contexts. But that is, of course, the subject of a different presentation. Oops, sorry. Now, in the context of this didactic quality of space-related utopias in Soviet and Russian cinematography, abstract becoming, unconcerned per se with social structures or individuals, perhaps more aligned with the topic of this particular conference than the strictly regulated utopias described just now, abstract becoming was never among the privileged questions, featuring marginally and most often in opposition to the aforementioned mnemonic function of cinema. It can be traced as a prominent topic in few films, and these tended to generate limited popular and critical appeal. More often, however, this concern about radical alterity as a process seeps through the seams of films with a highly explorative attitude to the space age as the future of the socialist future. Here, it is detectable in abstract visualizations of the richness of outer space and possible extraterrestrial life, characteristic, for example, as you can see on this slide, of Pavel Klushantsev's works and productions, and also of productions influenced by his approach. For example, this popular science film from 1959 called I Was a Satellite of the Sun. I mean, these visualizations combining the human and the spacey are quite interesting. Now, if aligned with becoming and dynamism proper, the utopian impulse can also be found in several atypical productions, such as, for example, Yakov Protozanov's 1924 bourgeois utopia, Aelita, which was highly criticized. But it's actually really interesting because if it celebrates anything, it celebrates post-revolutionary Moscow, which is all under construction. Here you can see an orphanage, which is presented in a very loving, formidable way. There's also a film from 1967, Irina Povolotskaya's debut, very underappreciated in critical circles. This film scrutinizes the future of interpersonal relations and interspecies communication, including communication with aliens. A couple of years before Tarkovsky's Solaris, and clearly inspiring this film. There's also Per Aspera ad Astra, Moon Rainbow, and then productions from the 21st century, for example, Dreaming of Space by Alexei Uchitel and First on the Moon. This group of films shows that in the realm of fiction film, temporal vectors underlying orientations such as past and future are of relatively small structural significance, when we're talking about the question of utopian impulse. Now, these films are, in terms of their radical impulse to explore alterity, they're equally utopian, although they're looking back into the history of the space age as the utopian productions looking into the future. Now, equally influential as Klushantsev's emphasis on visualizations were Tarkovsky's ideas about space and its wonders as a mirror to be faced by humanity at large and human subjects in particular. If Klushantsev had used visualization of the unknown as a mode of thought, Tarkovsky's aesthetic at work in Solaris relied more on bracketing the unknown in order to allow confrontation with the self, an approach echoed to an extent in youth films, for example, Richard Viktorov's Per Aspera ad Astra, and later in German Jr.'s Paper Soldier from 2008. However, the majority of Soviet and even later Russian post-Soviet, post-1957 space science fiction films actually implemented a characteristic combination of these two modes of estrangement. In fact, the second point of today's presentation concerns the functions of the visual in these space science fiction films. If we look at the history of Soviet space-age science fiction cinema, ever since the Klushantsev moment in the 1950s and early 60s, visualization of space was, or of things in space, was used with increasing functional eclecticism, not only to propose to think the different characteristic of Klushantsev's popular science films and science fiction productions, but also to illustrate and to entertain. In most of the films for younger audiences, for example, Moscow Cassiopeia here on the left corner, in the left corner, and The Great Space Voyage, and in 21st century films such as Aziris Nuna, or crazy Russian space fantasy film from 2008, visualization of the unknown is entertaining, and at the same time, by way of emplotment, it's aimed at strengthening associations between certain features of existing society and its utopian variant. Particularly in the Soviet youth films, fantastic and fairy tale features thus mostly curbed rather than enhanced the estrangement effect. In this sense, post-Soviet Russian youth films like Aziris Nuna are more innovative, signaling transformations in screen representations of childhood from regulated mini-adulthood, as you can see if you look at these pioneers here, to recklessness and readily functioning, of course, both readily function as satirical critiques of adult societies. In terms of form, these children's films and youth films interestingly correspond best to Lucy Sargison's mapping of utopias as characterized on the level of form by estrangement, playfulness, and the figure of the visitor who comes to this alternative reality from the author's reality. A combination of all four devices only characterizes a fairly small proportion of the examined productions, and the figure of the visitor and the notion of play, these are particularly difficult to find in films from the 1950s, 60s, and even early 70s, because these classical Soviet space science fiction films are mostly gentle, didactically framed estrangements aimed to inspire faith in a better future, and quite directly, often in contrast to literary bases for such films, to mention, for example, Toward a Dream from 1963. So in these films, the space future is often framed as a dream that should be regarded from afar rather than visited. This device, I think, ensures the reception of the film as pure fiction, unrepresentative of reality today. Now, despite this disclaimer, it was film and sometimes theater and not literature that often got accused of simplicity in its visualizations of alterity. Apart from the dream device, a very similar logic marked recent 21st century space blockbusters, which may then equally plausibly be interpreted as nostalgic of the past, as of this past's dreamy fictions. The nostalgia for a lost utopia, detectable in these action films, differs from the one characteristic of the somewhat introverted productions from the first decade of the 21st century. Having embraced the utopian impulse to construct anew and to reconstruct in a better way, but not utopia as a predefined form, these films, such as Dreaming of Space, Paper Soldier, First on the Moon, these films attempted to align nostalgia with the past as such in its multitude, as opposed to a particular interpretation of history. Now, a final point that I'd like to make in this presentation is about intertextuality as a constitutive feature of all the utopias described above, and as evidence of the film's active transtemporal polylogue. An intertextual reference worth highlighting are images of the dying planet, destroyed by humanoid or human intervention, characteristic of disparate production from not only in the Soviet context. You will probably be familiar with Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth from 1976. But in the Soviet context, we have Paraspora ad Astra and then Kindzadza from 1986. In Soviet context in particular, the youth production Paraspora ad Astra was the first film from 1981, as you can see, to grant subjectivity not only to a humanoid alien, Nia, played by a model, but nevertheless, they made her without a belly button to highlight the alienness. But more importantly, they gave agency to an entire planet, the planet Dessa. Planet Dessa not only demonstrated the official recognition of the dangers of non-reflected exploitation of the environment, but it signaled to move toward planetary consciousness on screens, a move anticipated in Soviet science fiction literature decades prior, by the way. Now, in counterpoint to these pessimistic images, the solid trope of rural and at the same time technologically advanced Soviet communities on Earth, as you can see here, characteristic of pre-1980s Soviet science fiction imagery, seem more utopian than outer space. In fact, outer space is dark, really. Moreover, both in a synchronic perspective, juxtaposed against the darkness and the perils of outer space in particular films, and in a diachronic perspective viewed alongside the images of Dessa or Planet Pluk from Kindzadza, or even post-nuclear war Earth in Dead Man's Letters, these ideal havens of knowledge and communitas replicated the uncanny dynamic of idyllic world and its dark side, the zone of terror, misery, and violence, which Alana Gomel described as an overarching characteristic of the Stalinist modernization process. Now, to conclude, let me point out that this outlined formal and substantial intertextuality is not just a matter of cultural production or representation, but also of agency in the most political sense of the term. This is quite clear from the consistent appropriations of Soviet, both the socialist realist and the deconstructively utopian structures, the first by modern historical blockbusters. You can see a couple of screenshots below. And the second by auteur films from the first decade of the 21st century, films aimed at reinterpreting dominant narratives of the memory of the space age and its utopia. I think I'm a bit over time, so I'll finish here. Thank you for listening. And this is the book which will be out in a couple of weeks, and where you can read about all of this in much more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia.